Let's take a look at the foundations of modern government budgeting. Before the US Civil War, budgeting was rather informal and routine at all levels of government. Beginning with the presidency of Thomas Jefferson in 1801, agencies seeking funds had dealt mainly on their own with congressional committees having jurisdiction over their respective operation. Starting with the Civil War, some important long-term changes began to affect numerous government practices, and the framework of a truly national economy slowly took shape. The first of these changes was the growth in the national government's authority to regulate the expanding industrial economy and to exercise war power in foreign affairs, where the president's role especially was enhanced. The regulatory power represented government response to the Industrial Revolution and to the emergence of powerful private economic interests. Starting in 1864, when the National Banking Act created a single, unified banking system as another step towards a national economy, the government's role in financial affairs became more regularized. In the 20th century, this included not only increasing regulation of private economic enterprise, but also greater participation in planning and managing various public enterprises. Since 1933 and the New Deal era of Franklin Roosevelt, fiscal and regulatory policies have been the predominant instruments of the national government in influencing the economy. The third pattern was growth in presidential strength and influence beginning in the last half of the 19th century and continuing to today. Action by Congress delegating discretionary authority to the president was a reoccurring feature of the 20th century. In the 1970s, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter exercised presidential prerogatives a bit more cautiously in view of the public's negative reaction to the Watergate scandals. The Clinton administration took specific actions to measure and manage expenditures, emphasizing performance improvement standards and better reporting systems. The budgetary and economic policies of George W. Bush were largely driven by additional discretionary spending required to support U.S. armed forces in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Before President Obama was elected in 2008, the economy had fallen into recession. Several years of escalating real estate prices, poor mortgage lending and underwriting practices, and other risky financial market ventures led to a market crash in September 2008, which significantly deepened the ongoing recession. Lower tax revenue and recession-induced spending for unemployment assistance contributed to substantially higher federal budget deficits in 2008 and in 2009. They raised the stakes of budgetary decision-making by increasing the scope and economic impact of such decisions and their effect on political interests as well. They created the necessity of effectively coordinating scattered spending activities of the national government. Primarily among these reforms was the concept of the executive budget. The chief executive was placed in charge of developing and coordinating budget proposals for the entire executive branch prior to the presentation to legislature at the state level as well as in Washington, D.C. At its simplest, a budget can be a device for counting and recording income and expenditures. Many fiscal and other public policy functions also can be served through budgeting, some or all of them simultaneously. Another function of budgeting is to generate a statement of financial intent constructed on the basis of anticipated income and expenditures. A closely related function is to indicate programmatic intent, showing priorities and deciding what to do with available funds. Budget should also reflect the mission or purpose for a bureaucracy agency's existence. In recent decades, many budget decisions are made and evaluated in terms of how they affect general economic growth, as well as specific economic and political interests and concerns. Legislatures who cherish control of the government's purse strings often use that control to influence agency behavior. The budget of any organization may be read as something of an index relative to distribution of power in economic and political systems in which the budget was enacted. Budgets represent authoritative decisions to spend or reduce money in certain ways in preference to others, and such decisions don't just happen. They're made through a political process in which power and persuasion are critical to success. Because the outcomes of budgetary decision making are so important to all participants and beneficiaries, the formal nature of the decision process has long been central to budgetary politics. Under the Constitution, all money bills must originate in the House of Representatives. Congressional committee chairs jealously guard their prerogatives in the areas of revenue collection and in spending. In recent decades, the incremental decision-making model has decreased in application, explaining how budgets are proposed and enacted. The goal was to make budgeting more rational through reallocating and reducing the influence of politics and strengthening the overall perspective of policy evaluation in the process. Partisan conflict over budget priorities, especially in the context of divided government, has dominated budget decision making and has contributed to increased spending for the past 30 years. The major reason for this is that federal programs known as entitlements for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and veterans benefits are distributed on a formula basis. As a number of these eligible benefits rise, expenditures automatically increase. Mandatory or direct spending is a category of outlays from budget authority provided in laws other than appropriation acts for entitlements and budget authority for food stamps. Discretionary spending is another category of budget authority that comprises budgetary resource and appropriations acts. Recently, new requirements for weapons systems, intelligence gathering, and homeland security have arisen from the war on terrorism. These have combined with entitlements to drive up the overall government spending and potentially eliminate discretionary spending altogether. The rise in new congressional budget committees also designed to enhance Congress's ability to monitor expenditures. Concern has also risen on the part of legislatures and the public over continuing annual deficits in the national government budget. Budgetary decisions and decision processes and changes in both are heavily influenced by their political environments. Government budgets are increasingly viewed as instruments for managing national economies. Their impact depends on the relative significance of the public sector in the total economic picture and on the willingness of citizens to accept the authority of governments over the private sector as legitimate. Fiscal policy refers to government actions aimed at development and stabilization of the private economy. This includes taxation and tax policy, expenditures, monetary and credit controls, and management of the national debt. Budgets can be regarded as instruments of fiscal policy aimed at consciously influencing the economic life of a nation. Different governments regard this potential budgetary role quite differently. Similarly, the extent to which national budgets in other countries are treated as tools of fiscal policy varies widely. Fiscal policy, as we use the term here, refers to government actions designed to develop and stabilize the private economy. They include taxation and tax policy, direct budget expenditures, management of the national debt, and indirect tax expenditures. Related to fiscal policy, and ideally fully coordinated with it, are monetary and credit controls. The primary tool of fiscal policy is taxation, which has traditionally been viewed simply as a means of raising government revenue. Taxation is the primary means by which governments raise revenues for public services. Taxes can be collected from individuals and corporations on income, earned and unearned, profits, property values, sales, and services. For the past 50 years, however, taxation and tax policy have also been used to influence the volume of spending by private citizens and of organizations. Raising taxes has at times been a weapon against inflationary spending because it reduces the amount of disposable personal income. Reducing taxes, for example, to increase consumption and spend your way out of a recession works very nicely, assuming that such spending doesn't trigger increased higher interest rates and inflation. The uncertain condition of the national and global economies raises new questions about how to use tax policy as an instrument of economic management. As with tax policy, there have been fundamental changes in attitudes towards government expenditures. Gross domestic product, GDP, is the sum of goods and services produced by the economy, including personal consumption, private investments, and government spending. Millions of businesses, individuals, and state and local government institutions depend on federal revenue for basic services and support. These installations pump millions of new dollars into the local and state economies. This has the effect of increasing tax revenues in all taxing jurisdictions, both state and local, and in general, strengthening the locality's financial basis because of new jobs created and increased population. A third fiscal policy tool is management of the national debt. The national debt is the accumulation over time of the difference between the amounts the federal government spends and collects in taxes. When a government sells bonds, it changes the composition of privately held assets, converts private assets to money to bonds. National debt is the cumulative sum of borrowing necessary over time to pay the difference between the amount raised and the amount spent in the annual federal budget. Whereas the national debt represents cumulative red ink, the budget deficit is the difference between how much the federal government collects and spends every year. In state and local government, debt management is similarly complex, if only because many state constitutions require both state and local governments to operate with balanced budgets. Nevertheless, most states and localities have extensive bonded indebtedness, meaning that they issue interest-bearing bonds, generally free from federal taxation, to raise funds for specific stated purposes. Bonded indebtedness is a revenue-raising tool for governments to issue notes or promises to pay a certain amount, principal, at a certain time, maturity date, at a particular rate of interest. Tax expenditure financing is a practice of giving favorable tax breaks for certain kinds of spending by individuals, nonprofit institutions, religious organizations, professional sports franchises, and corporate enterprises. Tax expenditure financing is revenue losses from provisions in the federal, state, or local tax codes. Monetary controls are ordinarily exercised in two principal forms by national and state governments. First, the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System regulates the supply of money released into circulation. Restricting the money supply has been used to restrain inflation, while increasing it lowers interest rates and stimulates economic activity. Interest rates charged by lending institutions are subject to regulation by the states. And as we've seen in recent years, the prime lending rate the banks make available to their borrowers influence business investment, new home construction, and financing of home mortgages. In somewhat different ways, government loan programs make a crucial difference in a wide range of activities, such as FEMA disaster loans for hurricane and flood victims and VA or FHA loans for buying or building a house. Poor management of loans and mortgage insurance programs contributed to the financial collapse of 2008 through 2010 and forced many homeowners into bankruptcy. Loans are controlled in part by the budgetary process in the form of initial appropriations and yearly expenses to continue operation of loan programs. Furthermore, loan guarantees have become increasingly important for a broader segment of societal interests. Underlying all government activity to influence the private economy is the public acceptance or legitimacy in principle of that activity. Central economic coordination has come to mean a dominant role for the president both in determining the existence of crisis conditions and in directing governmental responses. Even with all the powers at the president's disposal, he or she lacks the tools to manage its performance in all but the most indirect ways. The economic impact of continuing budget deficits raises the fear that deficits, if left unchecked, will trigger new cycles of inflation and recession. Budget surpluses occur when government brings in more revenue than it spends. Gross national product, or GNP, is the sum of goods and services produced by all Americans, whether they are located around the world during any given period of time, typically a year. As unemployment increases, government spending on counter-cycle measures will also rise as revenues from sales and income tax usually decrease. Higher levels of structural unemployment resulting from permanent loss of jobs or outsourcing in certain sectors of the global economy are more difficult to deal with. Regardless of how this problem is addressed, the rules of the game in coping with budget deficits have changed within the context of overall economic and fiscal policy. We now have a mixed public and private economy in which both sectors overlap considerably. At the same time, the problems confronting government have changed, making economic coordination and stimulation more difficult. Budgetary decisions are connected to all government attempts to influence the national and regional economy. At the same time, debt management and monetary and credit controls have only incidental relationships to the budget process. Monetary and credit controls relate to the budget process in that appropriations are needed to pay expenses for ongoing loan programs. Of much more direct consequence to budgeting and tax policy, expenditures, the power of interest groups to create and maintain tax loopholes, and economic coordination. Tax decisions are normally made outside the direct focus of budget making and involve a different set of participants both in Congress and in the executive branch. House Ways and Means Committee is the primary committee in Congress concerned with taxation and fiscal policy. Senate Finance Committee is the principal Senate committee concerned with revenue generation, taxation, and operations of the Internal Revenue Service. Expenditure policy is budget making when all is said and done. The effects of spending decisions on national, state, and local economies can be dramatic. Entire communities that depend on money for generated by military expenses, for example, become vulnerable when budgets are cut. National government spending is important for its effects on the nation's economy, as for its impact on operations of government agencies funded through direct budgetary allocation. Economic coordination is tied closely to budget making because a budget is a major instrument of the government's economic policies. A fragmented nature of American political decision making has a great impact on the complexity of the budget making process. Most governments budget on an annual or biannual basis, though not all funds approved for expenditure are actually spent in that year. Each stage of budget making is predominantly under the auspices of either the executive or the legislative branch, though few functions in budgeting are exclusively the responsibility of either one. Another element is the distinction between budget obligations, also referred to as budget authority, and actual outlays of funds. Budget obligations are orders placed, contracts awarded, services rendered, and other commitments made by government agencies during a fiscal period that require expenditure of public funds during some future period. Budget outlays are agencies' expenditures during a given fiscal period, fulfilling budget obligations incurred during the same or a previous period. The stages of the budget process include preparation, authorization, appropriations, execution, and audit. The authorization stage has historically involved determination of maximum spending levels or caps for each program approved by the legislative branch. Authorizations may be enacted for expenditures in the same or subsequent years, making this highly significant in terms of specific provisions. The majority of state governments and almost all local governments draw up their budgets without incorporating an authorization stage into their procedures. Appropriations, which happen after authorization, grant the money to spend or the power to incur financial obligations, and the appropriations committees in the two houses play the major role in the phase of the budget process. Backdoor financing is the practice of eliminating discretionary decision-making control from the appropriation stage of the budget process. Entitlement legislation has major implications for authorization and appropriation processes because no limit is placed on the total amount of budget authority for a program. The political impacts of backdoor spending, special orders, and mandatory entitlement programs include obstacles that must be cleared in order to address the fundamental issue of whether such programs should be continued. Continuing resolution is a type of appropriation used by Congress to fund agencies when a formal appropriations bill has not been passed. Sequestration is the withholding of budgetary resources provided by discretionary or direct spending legislation according to an established formula up to the dollar amount that must be cut in order to meet the deficit reduction target. Reconciliation is an important step in congressional budgeting when Congress makes adjustments in existing laws to achieve conformity with annual spending targets adopted in each year's concurrent resolution. The key step, following committee recommendations, is House and Senate action on an omnibus or all-encompassing reconciliation bill. Pay-as-you-go, PAYGO, is a procedure requiring that spending increases be offset by other decreases in annual appropriations so as to not increase the deficit. Agency personnel, in the course of program operations, may transfer funds from one account to another, reprogram funds for related uses, and defer spending to build up cash reserves. At any given time, an agency head or budget officer can be given attention to as many as 4 fiscal years. The first actions for budget reform were taken at the local level as part of a larger movement from general reform of local government. By the mid-1920s, most major American cities had adopted some form of a budgeting system, in most cases strengthening the chief executive's budgetary role. At the state level, a strong movement for reform was underway between 1910 and 1920, centering on making the executive accountable by first giving them the authority over the executive branch. By 1920, budget reform had occurred to some extent in 44 of the then 48 states, and by 1929, all states had centralized budget offices. Throughout this same period, action was also being taken at the national level, triggered by President William Howard Taft, who had established a commission on economy and efficiency. This generated a report which recommended a budgetary process be instituted under the direction of the president, a proposal greeted with considerable skepticism by those who feared any such grant of authority to the chief executive. The critical purpose in all these developments was to control expenditures, with an emphasis on accounting for money spent in public programs. Line item budgeting was the first modern budget concept to gain acceptance, and it remained the predominant approach to budgeting throughout the 1930s. In this period, budgets were constructed on a line item or object of expenditure basis, indicating very specific terms in terms of the services purchased and their cost. The emphasis was on control with detailed itemization of expenses, centralized supervision of purchasing and hiring practices, and close monitoring of agency spending. The focus was on how much each agency acquired and spent, with an eye to completeness and honesty in fiscal accounting. Performance budgeting is an approach to modern executive budget making that gained currency in the 1930s and again in the 1950s. It emphasizes not only resources acquired by an agency, but also what it did with them, promoting effective management of government programs. Performance budgeting differed from previous control orientations in several ways. First, it was directed towards promoting effective management. Second, it dealt not only with the quantity of resources each agency acquired, but also what it did with the resources. Third, it called for redesigning expenditure accounts, developing work and cost measures, and making adjustments in the roles of central budgeters and their relationships with the agency. Performance budgeting demanded a greater degree of centralized coordination and control. Planning program budgeting was an instrument of executive budgeting designed to alter processes and impacts of government budgeting in significant ways. As the label implies, it was aimed at improving the planning process in advance of program development and before budgetary allocations were made. It was intended to make programs, not agencies, the central functions of budget making. Proponents promised it would make it possible to relate budget decisions to broad national, state, or local goals. In the words of one observer, the determination of public objectives and programs became the key budget function. It facilitated assessments not only of agency resources and activities, but also of the actual external effects of those activities. It seemed that making the PPB work for the entire executive branch would require centralized control over composition of executive budget proposals, as well as over planning, determination, and evaluation of goals. In the early stages, some thought PPB would reform budgeting in the national government to bring about greater rationality, less politics, better and more informed decisions, and so on. Congress was a major source of resistance to PPB for much of this period, especially by the appropriations committees. Congress objected to the implication that it was up to the executive branch to determine the nation's programmatic goals and programs themselves. Congress was not likely to be receptive to a budget system stressing economic rationality. In Congress, simplifying budget choices and minimizing conflict over them was a way of life. It failed to recast national budgeting from a repetitive process for financing permanent bureaucracies to an instrument for deciding the purposes of programs of government. Much of the PPP package may have been dismantled, but some components live on, like a basic focus on information, concern with the impact of programs, emphasis on goal definition, and a planning perspective. Implementation of PPP went forward in several states and a number of local governments, many of which tried it in the wake of the national government experience. In the 1970s, other concerns began to emerge that drew attention away from PPP and towards different issues in the budgetary process. Problems of financing activities and evaluating their effectiveness are not confined to government. Business and industry have also had to confront these issues. Zero-based budgeting, known as ZBB, was developed in industry during the same period of time when some in government were installing elements of it there. ZBB involved three basic procedural elements within each administrative entity. The first was identification of decision units, the lowest level entities in a bureaucracy for which budgets are prepared. Staffs, branches, programs, functions, and even individual appropriation items. Second was analysis of these decision units and formulation of decision packages by an identifiable manager with authority to establish priorities and prepare budgets for all activities within the administrative entity. The third procedural element was ranking of decision packages from highest to lowest priority. Higher level agency officials next establish priorities among all packages from all units with the probable available funding in mind. The highest priority packages that could be funded within the probable total dollar allocation then were included in the agency budget request. Each manager prepared several different decision packages pertaining to the same set of activities to allow those conducting higher level reviews to select from alternative sets of proposals from the same program or function. In practice, ZBB did not project budgetary allocations at zero before analysis of activities was begun or reallocate funds on a large scale from some policy areas to others. Realistically, such a schedule would not be workable because budget makers did not have the authority or the tools to conduct these examinations on a regular basis. Although regarded by some as a rational comprehensive budgeting tool, the evidence suggests that ZBB was essentially a form of incremental budgeting. Resources have always been scarce in the sense that there is rarely, if ever, enough to satisfy all the pressures on the public treasury. Declining rates of growth, absolute shrinkage of tax bases, and rising inflation, coupled with recession, puts governments in a new fiscal squeeze. Getting the most out of existing resources becomes a recurring theme, with renewed emphasis on both economy and efficiency as public agencies adjusted to harsh realities. The level of political tension rose as various interests in government processes had to repeatedly defend their claims for government support. When the total pie becomes stable or actually decreases in size and costs rise rapidly, the competition generally intensifies. Controllability of spending becomes a matter of premier importance and political debate. The controllability issue raises questions about government's ability to truly control the purse strings. States, unlike the national government, often have constitutionally mandated expenditures, with specific earmarking of revenues for designated purposes, leaving the legislature without discretion to change them. And ironically, as fiscal constraints on government grow significantly, there is a major rise in the proportion of the national budget accounted for by expenditures that are uncontrollable under existing law. These outlays are uncontrollable in that expenditures are legally mandated unless Congress changes the law. The fact of the matter is, controllability of budget must come through non budgetary mechanisms and the will to use them. One such approach is improving the efficiency, productivity, and quality of existing programs. The magnitude of financial problems in the public and private sectors call for more to be done to alleviate these difficulties. It's therefore useful to examine briefly some large-scale dimensions and questions concerning budgeting and government spending. Growth in spending relative to both our nation's population increase and the private economy's growth measured in terms of GDP has been significant but not necessarily excessive. In the absence of stronger economic performance in the private sector, increased taxes combined with spending restraint may be one of the best options available to combat chronic budget deficits. Although we as a nation have long resisted taxation without representation, lately many seem to be almost equally unhappy about the prospect of taxation with representation. Another difficulty is that cutting spending continues to have broad popular appeal, even if most of the national government's annual expenditures are beyond reach unless entitlements are cut. If the president and a majority of Congress agree to change present law, no entitlement is guaranteed, and no expenditure is actually uncontrollable.